There's a good deal of foggy thinking about big words and those difficult words and hard to learn words and their use in good writing. Clear up all that thinking. Think of it in this way. Little used words, words that are not much in circulation. The fact is that there are many, many big, complicated words that are in great circulation, and such a majority of the population knows them well that we don't think of them as difficult words. Look at the word psychology. Psychology is a word that involves a great deal of meaning and a certain amount of learning to use it correctly, and yet it is in such wide use that we don't think of it as a hard word. There's a myth that people these days talk a lot more simply than they used to, and people used to have a much better vocabulary. The truth is that actually people have a different vocabulary, and there are so many words in common use today that just didn't exist 100 years ago. So what I propose is when you want to work with an extended and enriched vocabulary, you apply the same rules that you apply to little used words. Okay, there are types of words called jargon, and what jargon is are words that are particular to a trade. Like, let's say that there's automotive jargon, so that when you're talking with mechanics, they know a lot of words that most people don't know. They know exactly what a carburetor is. They all these, if it would sound a lot of it wouldn't have any meaning to people who didn't know the hundreds and hundreds of words only used to describe automobiles. One of the where you'll find a lot of excellent examples on how to introduce little used words to readers in a way that does not trip them up and does not distract from their enjoyment of your writing. Look at science fiction. Science fiction introduces a lot of scientific jargon, a lot of little used words, and so if you read science fiction, you'll start to learn a lot of the different tactics and ways that those writers have kept their writing fun and still introduced a lot of new vocabulary to their readers. Me personally, I love all the old words. In them, I find natural poetry. My favorite new one is vicissitude, and I went and I read it, and I went and I looked it up, and it's a quality of state of being changeable. And to me, that is pure poetry. I love that our language has all these old little used words that if we can, and in writing, I do not overdo it with little used words. I try as much as possible, on one hand, to use the most used words throughout, because those are the most effective. And then, if I find a situation where it would make the writing a lot, we bring these words in times when the writing would just be a lot simpler if you could bring in one of these more meaningful words. Like the word vicissitude. In one word, you can describe what would take many, many words or some awkward describing to convey. So if I'm going to write a paragraph and use the word vicissitude, what I want to do is make sure that I have that word in context, so that as the reader reads it, just by the context, they get a very good sense of what that word probably means. In a way, what you're doing is you're writing for two types of readers. You can have the reader that more or less is going to skip along the surface of your prose, and in that way they can still get enough to enjoy the story. And then you have the reader who might stop and look up words. If they're reading a science fiction film, they might get on the internet and find out what a quabit is or exactly what exponential means. And at the same time, you can have a reader who can still, just kind of skip over things they only have the vaguest sense about and still enjoy your writing. There are writers who can convey 10 times as much with using only the most used words than writers who use 10 times more vocabulary in their writing. The being able to convey to the most people is really the test of a good writer. Being able to make the most use out of the most common vocabulary. Being good at vocabulary is not about how many words you know, but about how well you can make use of the vocabulary you are using. Be humble. Just because you know a lot of words does not mean you're the only one on the planet who has a great vocabulary. What about bilinguals? They know words not in just one language but in two. And what about people that are in a specific trade? There are people that know words that you would need to go to college for 4 years in physics to be able to have a glimmer of an understanding of what those words mean. Another approach, know your audience. If you're a mechanic writing fiction about building engines and you're writing it only for other mechanics, fine. Use all of those words describing various components of an engine that no one else knows. If you're a poet who's using a lot of those old complicated words and you really want to write it just for people who really enjoy going and looking up a bunch of words, fine, write just for that. Now, have an awareness for who your audience is. If you want your writing to be accessible to anyone who might be interested in your writing, you might need to take a little bit more time. You might need a more thoughtful approach to your writing to be able to reach more people. There's another myth out there that the most common used language is somehow not as rich as a more vocabulary you might get from college level, and there's only a certain kind of truth to that. Being interested in language is about, I have studied language for years and years and years and years and years, and I'm still finding out, getting a better idea about the subtle nuances of the most common language, the connotations of the most used language, the idioms, the very rich way that the most basic use of English can be applied. I was riding on the bus last summer and I was eavesdropping on, there were two people at the front of the bus, obviously destitute, poor, people that you would not, just the way they were talking, I knew that they were not using college level vocabulary. And so the man was telling the woman about the apartment building he lived in, and the woman was like, is the rent fair? And the man was saying, I think the rent is fair. And the woman was asking, are the rooms big enough? And the man was saying, I think the rooms are big enough. Now, in those very simplest of words, there's very rich meaning by that use of language. The man was implying that in some way he didn't think the rent was fair and he didn't think the rooms were that big, but it was fair enough for him. The rooms were big enough for him. And if you open that window that language opened up. There's a whole world of meaning, and just look in that, write down what those people said and realize how basic and simple that vocabulary they were using was, and yet conveyed so much meaning. If you want a great example of how a good writer can be 10 times as inspiring and convey 10 times as much meaning with everyday language, read a Kurt Vonnegut novel and appreciate the power of great writing used in everyday language. It's helpful to ask yourself, what are my intentions as a writer? What am I trying to achieve through my writing? If your intentions are to inspire other people, ask yourself, is my writing, is it sort of like I'm setting up an obstacle course that people have to leap through, have to stumble over all of these little used words and try to squeeze themselves through some prose that they have to reread a few times before it begins to make sense to them. It's an exercise. The next time you're reading something and you read a word that you think you have an idea what it means but have never actually looked it up, go and look it up and be surprised by some of the different meanings, and write the word down, make some notes about the definition, and write a paragraph using that word, but for this one paragraph, really try to put it in context in a way, and what you're doing is you're strategizing, trying to use that word in context to best make it defined by the context it is in. Very much like example sentences. When you look up a word in the dictionary, it'll give you an example of its use. What you would consider a college level book, one thing that you'll see in these books more often is a more extensive vocabulary, and these books are written for an audience. This is written for an audience of people that on occasion will take the time to look up those words and will put forth extra effort to improve their own knowledge of these words so that they could make use of these more vocabulary extensive books. It would be much easier for me to go ahead and just use one of those words, but in the long run it's worth it to wrestle a little bit more with the language and work out the knots in it and just rephrase it in such a way that it conveys exactly what I want it to in a simple and easy to read way. Get over the idea that everyday language is somehow less intelligent than less used words. Everyday language is in common use because it comes out of all the things that are happening right now, that are real right now in current time. And everyday language has just as much meaning, just as much complexity, just as much nuance, just as much connotation, just as much layer of meanings as all other language, dead or alive. Recognize that there is always a trade-off. There are always advantages and different advantages to every possible way of writing. As we develop our particular approaches to writing, we accept the certain disadvantages that our approach has. What are your approaches? What are your strategies? How as a writer have you faced this situation? Please leave it in a comment below for me and the other viewers. Just imagine if there were someone from 200 years ago that listened to our language today, they would be blown away by these huge words that seem so complicated. And we today don't recognize it because it's just everyday talk. But these very bizarre, big, overly meaningful words like internet. If someone has a love of language, has a love of writing, I ask, does that include a love of everyday language? Because this is about the discoveries we can make in everyday language, and then really getting a very educated understanding about all the amazing things you can do with everyday language. One thing, and really, I rewrite all the time. I constantly go back to rewrite. And one thing I always ask myself, I'm particularly happy with a paragraph and I read it and I go, oh, this is great, I'm really happy with this, but can I make it more readable? Can I make it more digestible? Can I have it, can I make it so that the reader gets more immersed in what I'm saying? And by asking myself these questions, I might just take one word out, try a different word, change things around a little bit, and really become surprised at how kind of the magic of these different formulas of words that you can find so many different ways of saying the same thing. And if you can optimize it, that is really the fun part about writing. Thanks for watching. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoy my tutorials and would like to somehow thank you or thank me for putting them online, please, all I ask is that you take the time to go visit solomation.com, where I'm putting up my illustrated story to watch for free, and also to encourage me to make more of these. Please vote, hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. I hope your writing goes well, and I hope you have a good day. As an exercise for a week, whatever you read, like let's say that you read a news article each day, look up one of the words in that article, and it could be a word that you very much think you know, but just have a look at the way it's defined and its different uses and what its synonyms are, and do that one word each day for a week. I'm like, what about the word like velocity? It's like, do I really know what that means? I think I have an idea what it means. What about amplitude or magnitude? What exactly do these words mean? I use the computer for writing, and so if you're on the computer and you want to make the dictionary a bigger part of your life, try the freeware program WordWeb. Now I use Windows. I don't know if it's Linux or Macs, but possibly. WordWeb freeware program, what it is you can click on any word in any program, the internet browser, word processor, and it'll give you an extensive definition, and it's amazing, and I use it all the time, and it really makes for a super effective use of language. Language is not an inert thing. It is constantly changing, and everyone who speaks is constantly learning words that they didn't know a year ago, learning the definitions of words that they had never heard 3 years ago. So when people go to read, they are also partially in the frame of mind to use words they may not be entirely familiar with. It is our attempts as writers to make that as digestible as possible. Look at the word forensic. If you could go back in time and use that word for an audience of people that lived at that time, they'd be baffled. They'd have no idea what you're talking about. And yet today, when you talk about forensic evidence, most people understand that it has something that somehow at a crime scene there was some kind of scientific approach to getting more information from the crime scene than just a quick look around of what that crime scene looked like. What about like the word bacteria? That's an easy word. Everyone knows what that is. That's wrong. This is a word that is very rich in knowledge. This word really would take a lot to explain. That one word conveys a very great amount of, you need to learn a lot before you know exactly what that word means.